Radical markets, uprooting capitalism and democracy for a just society. That is an impressive set of ideas there. But before we begin, a quick disclaimer. I am not an economist.
No shit.
So when I come across subject matter dealing with markets and economic systems, I tend to shy away from making comment, since I likely wouldn't know what I am talking about. But the title of this presentation was something that I had a very hard time ignoring or not being curious about. So, as we proceed, I will be operating from a layman's perspective. My questions on, and comments about, this piece will probably be only rudimentary at best. I invite anyone who knows more about the vicissitudes of economic theory to leave a comment below to inform me, correct me, or to help clarify what our speaker is telling us all. So, with all of that being said, let's begin.
So, this work is the culmination of many years of sort of careful policy design research with Eric Posner.
Several years of careful, policy-designed research. So, this was not any kind of fly-by-night project. You put a lot of thought into this. Got it.
But in the 10 minutes I have to introduce it, I think rather than going into the details of all of the proposals that we have, it's best to just give you a flavor of the sort of broad idea that we're trying to get across.
A high-level summary. Thank goodness. 'Cause I are the dumb.
And I think that that's best conveyed by a thought experiment.
Oh boy! I love thinking! So, lay it on me.
So I want you to, for the moment, suspend your practical considerations and come with me on a journey of imagination to a fictive city that I'm going to call Marketopia.
Marketopia. So, a kind of utopia. Well, already, I am suspicious.
So Marketopia is a bit like Zootopia, except rather than being defined by having a diverse group of mammals that inhabit it, instead, Marketopia is defined by the fact that all the major private property in Marketopia, let's put aside personal effects like, heirlooms and pets and so forth, but all the land and the houses and the airplanes and so forth is continually up for auction to the highest bidder in a manner somewhat similar to the way that search terms are for Google advertisements.
All private property is routinely up for auction? So, aside from heirlooms and pets, there is really no private property. Everyone is just renting what they have in a glorified fashion, unless or until someone can outbid them? Okay. I have a lot of questions, but let's hear some more.
So, basically, whoever is currently the highest bidder on one of these pieces of private property controls it for the time being by making a rental payment continually into a central pot until someone else comes along and beats their price and takes over that rental payment for control of that asset.
So, if an airline owns 5 jetliners, let's say, then each of those jetliners could technically be owned, or maybe better, controlled, by 5 different people, who then pay rent on those jetliners, but presumably they are then also paid by the airline company to use their property? Otherwise, where would the jetliner controllers get money to pay the rent on the jetliners? Because if they're not making an income from having controlling interest over a jetliner, why would anyone bid on the planes in the first place? And if the airline is the entity who originally paid to have the planes assembled, was each bolt and each piece of metal that went into the making of those planes something they had to bid on first? And do those individual components then also end up being subject to auction? I am very, very confused.
And that's not just true of private property in Marketopia. In fact, many things that we would usually consider to be determined by collective decision-making processes, like the location of parks and the politicians that govern Marketopia, what sort of schools they have and what they teach and so forth. These are also determined by an auction process, though rather than auctioning them to the highest bidder, we add up the total willingness of everyone to pay for different alternatives, and we implement the one that people are willing in total to pay the most for.
So you differentiate between private property and public assets, but public assets are up for auction by the will of the people, but not auctioned so much as being selected for funding. So I assume you would have to employ a voting process in order to decide what property, like politicians, get financial priority? Yeah, I'm still confused.
And all the money that's raised by these auctions is continually returned to all the citizens of Marketopia in equal shares as a social dividend, or you might call it a universal basic income, much as in Norway and Alaska, when they auction off oil rights, they return the revenue that they raise to the citizens.
Okay, so I go to work and I earn money, and then I use that money to win an auction on a jetliner for some indeterminate amount of time until the next auction. And winning that auction provides me the privilege, I guess, of paying rent on the jetliner that I had bid on, and that rent is then distributed to the entire society in equal shares. And the advantage of possessing the jet is, what again? I mean, I assume that I can then lease the jetliner for whatever price I choose to any airline company willing to pay for it during the duration of my possessing the jetliner. And that money that I get from the leasing is money that I can keep all to myself. Right?
Right?
Oh, but here I am, thinking like a capitalist. And supposedly, we're trying to uproot capitalism with this radical market.
Now, when you hear this idea of Marketopia, it might sound like sort of the most extreme version of a free market that you can imagine. It's sort of like much crazier than anything that, say, Adam Smith could have imagined.
I have no idea what Adam Smith could or could not have imagined, but I will agree that everything you're talking about sounds totally cray-cray.
Because it makes you realize that even though we live in a market society, most things are not available for liquid purchase at any given point in time. most of the land on the Google campus, most of the stock of Google, in fact, not just the marginal units of stock that are currently on bid, but most of the stock that all of you hold. These aren't things you could just go out and buy at some price at any point in time.
But you think they all should be? Well, what if the owner of a thing doesn't want to sell it? What if it has some kind of sentimental value to the person? Even if you offer something that exceeds its estimated actual value, are they not allowed to say no?
Those are instead controlled by often wealthy, concentrated interests, and if you wanted to grab control of those assets, you'd have to enter into a long and drawn-out process of bargaining and probably pay many times what the person would be willing to accept, because they'd get wind that you'd want to buy that thing, right?
Right?
Right. If something is being bid on, then there's an inherent component of competition for control of that thing based on its perceived value. Thus, the bidding price will inevitably go up, especially if the system in place is one of auction, which is what you're proposing. I must be missing something.
And so Marketopia is a far more extreme, complete free market than any society in history. And that might lead you to think, okay, so in Marketopia, the wealthy are going to dominate everything, right?
Right?
The wealthy are going to be able to outbid the prices that anyone else is going to pay. They're going to take control of assets, and they're going to use that to dominate everyone else in society. But then you have to ask yourself, what do you mean by the wealthy?
Wealthy. Well, wealthy are the people who have more assets than others based on hours worked, depth and breadth of education, and or just being smart with their assets and investments. Maybe someone who has a ridiculously marketable talent above and beyond most other people. Or maybe someone who knows how to game the system to their advantage beyond the scope of your average mortal. At least, that's what I think of when I think of the wealthy.
Well, a wealthy person is someone who has lots of assets like stocks and bonds and houses and land and businesses, right?
Right?
But in Marketopia, there is no private ownership of those things. All of those things are continually auctioned for the public benefit.
And correct me if I am wrong here, but if no one in Marketopia has a financial edge over anyone else in Marketopia, how can anyone outbid anyone else for anything in Marketopia? Again, I must be missing something.
In fact, Marketopia is actually sort of the most extreme version of the sort of common ownership advocated by people like Karl Marx that you can imagine, much more extreme than forms of socialism that actually existed, which ended up in the control of those assets by a concentrated bureaucratic elite that often ended up tyrannizing over the rest of the population even more intensely than the capitalists that they claimed to replace.
You're proposing a system that is more extreme than even Karl Marx would have. So tell me, how has plain, old, tame Marxism performed in the past? What success stories might our speaker have to share, I wonder?
In Marketopia, on the other hand, there is true common ownership because by construction, all the value of all assets flow equally to all citizens. And by construction, every citizen has an equal right to compete for control of assets.
So, again, if there are no residents of Marketopia that have a financial advantage over anyone else in Marketopia, how can any competition for resources take place via auction. And if competition is taking place, then ultimately someone is going to have to gain some advantage over owning one piece of property versus another. Otherwise, why compete? Does the jet owner get to make money from the airline after winning the auction on the jet, or don't they?
So this might seem like a paradox, especially to those of us who grew up in the Cold War and post-Cold War periods. How can like the most extreme form of common ownership, a sort of communism, go along with the most extreme form of a free market?
It almost seems like it can't. But then, I am a layman, so by all means, educate me.
Well, while that might seem like a paradox, it's actually a crucial part of what was the central tradition in a field called political economy that gave birth to economics, political science, sociology, and many other fields during the late 19th century. And this idea called competitive common ownership was especially associated with the work of this guy here. And I wonder if anyone recognizes him. Who is it?
That's Henry George.
Wow! This is the first time anyone has actually managed to identify him.
This is the first time that anyone has identified him. Well, you know, that man's utter lack of modern notoriety is not doing a whole lot to bolster the argument that his ideas lacked longevity unjustifiably.
Henry George was the best-selling author in the English language, other than the Bible, for about 30 years. His book, Progress and Poverty, was the namesake of the progressive movement in the United States. He helped inspire the Chinese nationalist revolution and many other things. So he's an enormously influential person. And yet his ideas are largely forgotten in the post-Cold War era.
He inspired the Chinese nationalists and the progressive movement in America. And now he has largely been forgotten. Your sales pitch for that man's ideas is not getting any better.
And to argue that while these ideas were forgotten in mainstream culture, they continued to be developed in a field called mechanism design, which won lots of Nobel Prizes, but was largely applied to things like auctioning off search words at companies like Google and Facebook, rather than to the big problems of social organization, and to show that we can, based on this tradition, have a new way of organizing society to address our most pressing problems.
So, you want to treat private property and ownership like search terms being bidded on at Google. You want to plunge people's lives into a continuous flux of uncertainty and competition where I can never own a car, I can only have it so long as I can afford to outbid the other guy, and he then has to pay rent on what I already purchased, but I get none of that money because it goes into a common pool where everyone profits off of my car that the other guy won in the auction just for the privilege of winning it, I guess. And somehow, I lost my car to a higher bid, even though there's no such thing as someone who has more than someone else in Marketopia. Man, I am befuddled, because I think I understand what he is proposing, and consequently, what he is proposing is madness. Now, our speaker proceeds to go into more depth on his ideas and proposals for a more just society based around common ownership. But I am going to end this video here. I may tackle the rest of the presentation in the future, granted that my brain can handle that kind of radical insight. Because owning nothing By paying for everything sure sounds like some kind of paradise, doesn't it? As always, thank you for watching.